Scott just made the point.
Jefferson, you'll read to be a lot more secure, not just.
Brass bands playing in the town gazebo, mustachioed men in starched collars riding penny farthing bicycles, maybe a nice cool sarsaparilla while walking in the park with your best girl. Yes, who among us does not look back warmly when we consider the Apportionment Act of 1911? Surely you remember the Apportionment Act of 1911. The Apportionment Act of 1911, the one that set the number of congressional seats, which, as expected, had grown as the population had grown along with it, from 59 seats in 1789 to 242 just after the Civil War, and finally being frozen at the current 435 seats in the House of Representatives by the timely passage of that gnarly, radical, totally awesome piece of legislation called the Apportionment Act of 1911, which legally froze the number of congressional seats at the current 435 and which ended up giving us this. Now, from this chart, you can see that in the 1790s, one congressional representative might speak for 30 or 40,000 people. Today, one representative speaks for almost 700,000 people. Now, if we were to repeal the Apportionment Act of 1911 and return to the level of representation we had back when the federal government was in the size of the box that it came in, the House would not have 435 seats that it has today, but rather about 9,000 representatives or so, which brings us to the point of our three-part trifecta this week. Has America gotten too big to manage? Well, to discuss this issue in an in-depth manner, let's bring in our 143 co-hosts. Curse the Trifecta Apportionment Act of 2009. It's just Steve Green and Scott Ott. Gentlemen, let's just put aside the issue of representatives for a moment. Here's a picture of California's 2012 election map where Barack Obama blew out Mitt Romney 59% to 38%, picking up all of the state's 55 electoral votes, which is exactly 1/5 the number needed to win. Now, there's a lot of red in that map of blue California. So if California consisted of 5 or 6 or 7 separate states, this president would have had a much tougher time getting back into the Oval Office so that he could go ahead and trash the Constitution. So, Scott, let's start with you. Politically, anyway, is America just getting too big to handle?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, by the way, I recently heard that there are some people who have now mustered, I believe, 7 counties in California to secede from the state of California and form the state of Jefferson.
All right.
It's kind of an odd name for the state. I wouldn't have chosen Jefferson, but anyway, and I think they need like 15 counties to get consideration from the legislature or something like that. So, you know, who knows? Maybe something could happen there. The argument, by the way, against that map, that red and blue map, is that Democrats would say, look, dirt, don't vote. And that's the problem with that map. The densely populated areas, the urban areas, are the areas where the Democrats are concentrated and where they have their power base. And so the areas across the country generally that are solid red, and most of the country looks red when you look at it on a map, are areas that are less densely populated. And so that would be their argument there. It's interesting you bring up this point of representation, though, because George Washington, during the framing convention for the Constitution, sat for 4 months and said almost nothing as he presided over the Constitutional Convention. And then at the very end, right as they were about to take a vote to send this out for ratification, he suggested that perhaps 40,000 people per representative in the House would be too many, and it might be better if it were 30,000. And with that change, they then put it to a vote. It was the only suggestion that Washington made, at least publicly, during the course of the debates in the framing of the Constitution. So obviously he was concerned about that. I think that we have to look at the bigger concern here is, should the federal government be the one that is micro-representative, or should we be saying, hey, why don't the townships, the counties, the cities, and the states be the primary level of governance, and the federal government, it's fine if there are only 435 members in the House?
That's a pretty good argument, Scotty. In fact, if we want to go back to that map for a minute, I might add a corollary to that, because it is absolutely true that dirt don't vote. But it's equally true that graphic designers in Santa Monica don't produce food either. So you have to ask yourself if those people in the middle of that state who are doing all the food growing and all of the actual, work and stuff that gets the country fed, maybe they should have a right to have some sort of say in what happens on national elections here in America, especially since the progressives in Washington are killing the agriculture in the center of the state to preserve the Delta smelt, which is hopefully as delicious as a sardine, because if it was, we'd have 100 billion of them. Now, Steve, there's been a somewhat serious push in your own state of Colorado to break into smaller states to better reflect the moods of the people who are not living in the greater Denver area. Good idea, do you think?
Oh, sure, why not? Although, mostly these groups, and you mentioned California too, there have been all sorts of new state movements throughout the years. In fact, if you look at the web, there are some great resources on that, on states that never were, or that almost were, or that are still trying to be. And, this brings us to an interesting part of the history of the English-speaking world. English speakers divide, subdivide, recombine in all sorts of fascinating ways. The 13 colonies combined into one new nation, separating mostly peacefully from Canada. We came to blows from a couple of times. We separated for Britain in a war. We came to blows again. We almost came to blows another time or two in the 19th century. But since the First World War, we have been the best of friends again. And in World War II, we were practically one country with two leaders. It is a special relationship. When Britain was trying to figure out what to do with the peoples of New Zealand, the English-speaking peoples of New Zealand and Australia, their first thought was to make Eastern Australia and New Zealand one country, because that's where most of the people were, and the rest of Australia its own thing. And would Australian and New Zealand history really have been all that much different had they been subdivided in some different way? And the answer is no. It's a real genius of English-speaking peoples that we can do this, and we can do it mostly peacefully. And I say, why not give it a chance? Maybe we should make the rules a little more lax on how states can divide themselves and recombine themselves, because these lines on the map, they came up organically, and there's no reason, I don't think, they can't recombine in new ways just as organically.
Well, just as a quick aside, one of the things that just got me thinking about that's interesting, Steve, is that when the states' boundaries were actually determined, the entire states were rural. There were none of these kind of massive population density areas, certainly not out west anyway. So you can make the case that this is all an artificial change to the way the states were divided in the first place. Now, folks, as you may or may not know, there's only one precedent for a state being split off from another state instead of a new territory being added to the Union. That was the splitting off of West Virginia from Virginia during the Civil War. So it's been done once, and that was under fairly adverse circumstances. But look, folks, everybody knows the federal government's getting bigger. Well, the population's getting bigger too, so that's not necessarily a bad thing. What is a bad thing is that it just doesn't scale. What was once representative for 30,000 people, well, that will eventually mean one representative for 1 million people, or alternately, a House of Representatives with 10,000 representatives. Now imagine that goat rodeo. Any version of a future United States federal government that has the slightest response to the people, and don't think that's what they want in Washington, but it's presumably what we the people would want, a responsive federal government, will have to be smaller, more responsive, more localized, and less expensive. That's the precise opposite direction that the power and money control freaks that call themselves progressives want to take the country. So in our next episode, we'll talk about an economy that's too big to do anything but fail. And in our Members Only Part 3, we'll see 3 custom visions of what a workable United States might look like in the future. For PJTV, I'm Bill Whittle.